Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're gonna give a few minutes to let folks log on, and we'll go ahead and get started at the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us. See some additional people joining. Good afternoon, not good morning, everybody. We're just waiting a few minutes before we kick off the webinar to allow people to log on. Thank you. All right, looks like it's noon. Taylor, for sake of time, would you like to kick it off?
Hey, Robert, sorry, what did can you repeat that?
I'm sorry, said it looks like it's noon. Would you like to kick it off for the sake of time?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll leave a couple minutes here just for intros while we're waiting for everyone to join. But I really appreciate you joining today, our next installment of our legislative training series. This time we're focusing on AB 98, which is a new bill in California that was signed by the governor and goes into law very soon, as we'll talk about the effective date later today. But the idea for it really impacts how we plan for and develop logistics uses in California, but particularly in our region, in the Inland Empire counties of San Bernardino and Riverside. My name is Taylor Leibel-Varner. I am the Vice Director of Policy for the Inland Empire section of the American Planning Association. And so to our members and our guests, we're very grateful that you joined us today. We have an exciting agenda today but before we get into that, we want to start with our land acknowledgement. So I'll pass it to Rob.
Yes, thank you, Taylor. Good afternoon, everybody. Robert Flores, Chair of the programs for the Inland Empire section. I'd like to welcome you as well. I will love to do the land acknowledgement. I will begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Riverside County, specifically Moreno Valley, which is the traditional land of the Cahuilla people, according to the Digital Atlas of the California Native Americans. I'll send it back to Taylor. You're on mute, Taylor.
Great. All right, diving in. We have a full agenda today. So we're going to give you an introduction to AB 98 and its requirements. And most of the discussion will be spent in discussion and hearing from the panelists that we've invited today. We're very excited. And then we'll follow up the panel with audience questions and answers. So we hope you came with questions. As questions come up, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, we'll make sure you'll have the opportunity to come off mute and ask your question out loud as well. All right, so a few words on today's panel. We're very excited to have three very experienced experts on not just planning, but logistics and also in focus in the inland region. Jolene Hayes is joining from Fair and Piers. We have John Hildebrand from the County of Riverside, and Tracy Zinn from T&B Planning. But first, we want to give you a high-level overview of AB 98 before we dive deeper into the requirements. AB 98 is a result of last year's legislative session. It's actually a years-long effort, though, to address the impacts of the rapid expansion of the logistics industry in the state, and particularly in inland Southern California. The goal of the bill is to limit the expansion of new logistics projects and uses near what are called sensitive receptors, which is simply homes, daycares, schools, parks, hospitals, things of that nature. The bill has taken other forms in the past year and had not been successful, but this year it was pushed through the legislative process very aggressively right at the end. So there was no opportunity for iteration on this one like there normally is on a bill. And that resulted in kind of a very complex, pretty confusing bill that not only is going to be difficult to implement, but also it requires some cleanup in order to really enable stakeholders to implement the bill, and then new logistics development to comply with the requirements. So at a basic level, AB 98 does three main things. The first is what we call the general plan or policy updates. AB 98 requires the general plan and the circulation elements of each city and county general plan to include specific truck route requirements by specified dates. We'll have more on all of this later in the presentation. Secondly, the statewide, the AB 98 imposes statewide logistics use development standards. And it prohibits local agencies from approving new or expanded logistics uses near sensitive receptors unless these development standards are met. And finally, and this one we won't really get to today because it's not as relevant to our work as planners, but important to note that AB 98 requires the South Coast Air Quality Management District to collect and analyze air pollution data near logistics operation centers in our counties of Riverside and San Bernardino. Right. So before I hand it over to our panel to go deeper into these requirements, a few definitions that are important to keep in mind. One, what do we mean by logistics use? A pretty important definition. Essentially, what they mean is a building in which cargo, goods, or other products are moved or stored for later use or distribution. And that does not predominantly serve retail customers on site. And in which heavy-duty trucks are primarily involved in the distribution or the movement of cargo, goods, and products. There are some exemptions, including ones for facilities served by rail, where food or household goods are sold directly to the public, and then what they call an exemption for strategic intermodal facilities. And when we talk about expansion of logistics uses, so what is going to trigger some of the requirements we're going to talk about, we mean an expansion of 20% or more of the square footage of logistics use as defined above. And third definition, for those of us in the Inland Empire, which is most of us, we should be blushing because they thought particularly of us. The definition that we'll talk about later, but it is the warehouse concentration region. There are certain deadlines and requirements for projects and jurisdictions in warehouse concentration region, which is exclusively jurisdictions in the Inland Empire. So County of Riverside and San Bernardino, most people interpret that to mean the unincorporated areas, but there are others who are taking a more conservative interpretation, another thing we'll talk about later. But it also includes the cities of Chino, Colton, Fontana, Rupa Valley, Merino Valley, Ontario, Paris, Rancho Cucamonga, Redlands, Rialto, Riverside, and San Bernardino. Right, I'm going to hand it off to Jolene to put this, kind of tie all this together and what it means for local governments and development.
Thank you, Taylor, and good afternoon, everyone. just to give you a sense of, we work on a lot of general plan updates with cities throughout the Inland Empire and throughout California. So we've been watching this really closely. And one of the things that we've been trying to do for about the last decade is make sure that they establish truck routes. What's really changed in AB 98 is how those truck routes are established, how they're defined, and the requirement that they be incorporated into the circulation elements. So for those cities or counties that do not have designated truck routes already contained within their circulation elements, that's one of the main requirements that has to be incorporated for the Inland Empire, for those warehouse concentration region cities or in counties. It has to be, they have to be incorporated by January 1st of 2026. So that's a little more than a year away. The other piece of this is really how truck routes are defined. So it's limited to arterial roads, major thoroughfares, and predominantly commercially oriented streets, local streets. So it defines that as being streets that have 50% or more commercial or industrial uses on those local roadways. There's some confusion about this. Not every arterial has industrial or commercial. So is every arterial actually appropriate for a truck route? So there's a lot of work, I think, for the local agencies to do to go through and understand where those truck routes should be provided to make sure that they're serving the commercial businesses that are already in their cities. So making sure those routes there is a requirement that existing commercial and industrial uses can be served by trucks. So a route doesn't necessarily need to be designated as a truck route for trucks to operate on it, but any facility that comes in now with this law, those facilities that meet that requirement of 250,000 or more square feet must be planned on an existing truck route. So it's going to be really important for local agencies to understand what their current general plans and zoning codes look like, and what that means for being able to accommodate and apply or conform with AB 98. The other piece of it is how potential considerations for zoning and land use may affect what cities are currently planning. So there are a few cities that we're working with where they had mixed use as a buffer zone, for example, between industrial and residential. But since mixed use by definition tends to have residential as part of it, they've been pulling some of that residential out of that commercial to make sure that they don't preclude the ability for that industrial land to be constructed with industrial uses in the future. So just one of the things for cities to start thinking through. And then if they pull that housing out because of the RENA requirements, updating their housing element and making sure that they are moving that residential to another location. So there are a lot of things for cities to start thinking through under AB 98. Next slide. So the deadline, as I mentioned, for the warehouse concentration region is January 1st, 2026. For the rest of the state of California, it's just 2 years later. The enforcement is pretty significant for this particular legislation. The Attorney General can assess fees of up to $50,000 every 6 months that a jurisdiction is out of compliance. Next, I'll turn it over to Tracy.
Okay, thanks. Good
Oh, wait,
afternoon,
no,
everybody.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I jumped ahead too fast. Sorry, Tracy.
No, that's okay.
I'm supposed to cover this one too. So the setting criteria for logistics uses and the reason why this is directly tied into the truck routing requirements. And then I'll segue real quickly, but apologies for that. The real purpose is to make sure that your truck routes are not next to or adjacent to sensitive receptors to the extent possible, making sure that those logistics facilities, as they're being sited, and so as communities are starting to think through where those truck routes go, paying attention to where your schools and your housing is located and trying to avoid those to the extent possible. So there are some exceptions. If there is only one route, say you have a mountain in a way or you're up against an ocean, that's the only corridor that will provide access to those logistics facilities. Those are some exceptions that can be made. But those exceptions have specific requirements as to how they're approved. And now I'll turn it over to Tracy.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Tracy Zinn, I'm the president of TMB Planning. We're a consulting firm. We serve public agency and private applicant clients in submittal of entitlement applications. I also am an AICP certified planner, and I sit on NAOP's Inland Empire Chapter Board of Directors, as well as its legislative committee. I'm going to speak briefly about AB 98 site design requirements, but please note, as was mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there is cleanup legislation that's being pushed through and is likely to be seen in the next couple of months. So the site design requirements are what is in the currently adopted bill, but they are subject to change potentially with any cleanup legislation. Currently, the bill states that any logistics project with a loading dock that's within 900 feet of a sensitive receptor has to meet certain site design requirements. In the design of the project, the truck loading bays should be on the opposite side of the building from where sensitive receptors are located. The distance requirement is 300 feet from the property line of the nearest receptor, or 500 feet if you are in the warehouse concentration area, which is most of Riverside and San Bernardino counties. There's also different requirements if the site is already zoned for industrial use versus if the application includes a change of zone or a general plan amendment. So you'll need to read the bill carefully to be sure which requirements apply regarding the size of the building, as well as rezones and general plan amendments or not. Also, the facility's driveways, the bill indicates that there's a desire for passenger vehicle driveways and truck driveways to be separated. And for on-site drive aisles to have heavy-duty trucks positioned away from sensitive receptors. Also, there are requirements for buffering. So the bill states that there should be a minimum of 50-foot buffer to screen the facility from sensitive receptors. The buffer can include things like landscaping, walls, berms, and the minimum buffer in the warehouse concentration region, if there's a rezone, is 100 feet. So these are pretty significant buffering requirements. We don't typically see 50-foot or 100-foot buffers in a typical logistics facility design today before this bill is passed. Next slide. Additionally, as I mentioned, there's different requirements based on the size of the facility and whether a change of zone is associated with the application or not. There's two definitions in the bill regarding a 21st century warehouse or a tier 1 21st century warehouse. So depending on the conditions that are applicable to the application, some of the main features of a 21st century warehouse are items like energy efficiency features such as compliance with CalGreen, electrification of loading docks that serve cold storage, providing auxiliary power for the loading dock for any cool, freezer, or chilled space. By 2030, January 1st of 2030, all of the yard equipment, particularly the forklifts, need to be zero emission, and that is consistent with what the California Air Resources Board regulation will be, and also zero emission for other off-road engines. That's like the yard equipment, the equipment that pulls the trailers around in the yard. Additionally, if the building is larger than 250,000 square feet, the bill is indicating that the switch gear needs to be microgrid ready. The utility meters need to be have advanced smart metering. And the EV charging needs to be installed at 10% of the passenger vehicle parking spaces, which is more stringent than CalGreen currently requires. And this is a big one, or at least 50% of the passenger vehicle parking spaces need to be EV ready, meaning conduit needs to be installed from the electrical room of the building to 50% of the passenger car parking spaces. And an earlier implementation of the zero emission forklifts by 2028 instead of 2030. I'll pass it on to John.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Hildebrand, Riverside County Planning Director. I've been in the county now for about 9 years, sitting in the big chair for about 3 years. As a practitioner, and for those of you online today who work for the public sector, we have the unenviable task of implementing all of these wonderful provisions that are mandated by the state. And one of them that has absolutely no implementation strategy other than we have to figure it out is this first one, this replacement ratio of a 2-to-1 with an 10-year look back and displacement assistance required. With the cleanup, I'm hoping that this will be significantly modified or just go away altogether. But how do we implement this is something we're still sort of looking at. Are we asking that the warehouse developers now turn into residential developers? Are they required to place new housing somewhere nearby? Are they required to construct it? Are they required to construct it within a certain time frame? Is there an opportunity for an in lieu fee to hire a residential developer to do the same thing? So I'm not sure what the intent was for how to physically implement this. The other sort of unintended consequence of this is if you look at oftentimes where warehouse development is going, it's mixed in sometimes with sort of a haphazard remedy houses that have kind of been there for a million years that are oftentimes very much substandard and are barely being used as a house anymore. You'll see these houses mixed in with leapfrog warehouse development in the middle of these areas that may be being used as contractor storage yards or some other unpermitted business in substandard housing. So this concept of replacing substandard housing at a 2-to-1 could have an unintended consequence of disincentivizing industrial development because of the costs associated with it, which then means you don't get the improvements, you don't get the new roads, the infrastructure built to remove the substandard housing to get the industrial new jobs creation anyways. So this is a really odd provision that doesn't have a good way of implementing it. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what that's going to look like when we have to apply this to new industrial. So we're hoping that this thing will either be modified to make it easier to implement or just goes away altogether. If you want to tackle housing production, do it from the other way around, right? Look at RENA, look at HCD, look at all buy right bills, all housing legislation that's being also pushed down from the state as a different way to obtain housing rather than requiring to be replaced at a 2-to-1 for warehouse development and jobs creation. So that's my 2 cents on that one. Truck routing plan. This is also a huge deal. We're now required to come up with designated routes for truck routing for an entire county within 1 year. Also a very difficult task to do. We have to coordinate with all of our cities within Riverside County, and even some of the cities right now in Riverside County are fighting each other over where those truck routes come and go out of their own cities, let alone from a regional perspective. We also have to coordinate with our counties neighboring to us, Orange County, LA, and San Bernardino counties, to understand where their truck routes are coming and going and where ours are being sent and coming and going as well. This is also unfunded and required to be done within a year. So first question is, how do we pay for this? Who pays for this? Who takes the lead on coordination efforts on a regional scale to come up with policies, truck routing designations, and amendment to our circulation element, and to coordinate all those things on that scale? It's going to be a really difficult task to do, but that's what's asked of us in this new legislation. So we had our Board of Supervisors initiate yesterday the request to do this. So we're going to start scoping this out and see what that looks like on a regional scale. We're going to have to loop in probably WRCOG, RCTC, San Bernardino's version of that as well, to kind of start having the dialogue on how to coordinate and come up with a consensus for truck routes on the county-wide. So more to come. Next slide, please. Okay, exemptions. With every rule, there's always a get out of jail free card, exemptions for doing things. You know, the existing developments, this is an interesting one of what constitutes a project, who's exempted from these provisions, and when. And it's very confusing how the legislation was written. We've sort of simplified it here at the county in a couple of different ways. Implementing projects. So for us, it would be a plot plan. For others, it might be a development plan, but something that physically is looking to entitle an industrial development would be the implementing project. If it was submitted, timely filed prior to the September 30, 2024 date, it is exempt from these rules provided that it gets approved and adopted by whatever legislation has to happen on your end, prior to January 1st, 2026. So that is 1 year from now, something submitted prior to that September date, up until that January date. If it gets approved, these rules don't apply to that project. Anything submitted after this, also has to be approved by that date. The county did something, a little bit differently. Because we knew this was the mandate, these were coming, our board of supervisors took action yesterday to simply adopt all of the rules, regulations, operational considerations in AB 98. We slapped them all into our good neighbor policy, and the board adopted those, and those rules are in effect today. So we got to jump on those dates ahead of time. But ironically, a lot of those rules and provisions in this bill we're already doing. We're already requiring them as conditions of approval. We're already looking at siting, building orientation, buffering, setbacks, landscape, all the things that are mandates we've been doing and requiring for a long time now. So most of these requirements are not really a big deal, at least for the county. Some of them will be, but others, again, they're just a matter of fact or how we just do business here in the county. So that's the mix between those couple of dates there. So you want to be careful evaluating and assessing what a project is. As an example, our county does general plan changes a little uniquely here. They're called foundation GPAs. We have a cycle every 8 years. So we had a bunch of foundation general plan and standalone amendments submitted at the beginning of the year, but they're not projects. They're not projects under CEQA. And we were debating whether or not the properties on which an industrial development is going to go, if there was a FGPA that was submitted back in February this year, counted as the project. The board and the planning department had these lengthy discussions about this and made a determination that the FGPA itself does not count. It doesn't substitute for the timely filing. So that application is not a project. The only project is the actual implementation of what we call a plot plan. So we had to make that distinction very clear for the developers, and that was our determination internally. The other weird exemption, which baffles me also, is this concept of a mixed use, right? And if we're putting some sort of housing or multifamily adjacent to industrial, which creates a new set of sensitive receptors within close proximity where a warehouse is going. I understand that there's a need to do that for workforce housing, to provide proximity for the workers, but it sort of negates this whole setback scenario. So looking at that as an exemption, there would be, I think, higher level of design considerations going into how those two things are compatible, how they work together, how they're sited together. But it is an exemption that can be taken advantage of under this bill.
Awesome. Thanks, John. That really tees us up for our discussion with you all on, now that this is law, we hope that things will be cleaned up, and we're going to talk about that. But for the meantime, we have to implement this. And as the panelists have talked about, our timelines are tight. So we want to highlight some of the statewide, local, and regional efforts that are underway to implement and clean up AB 98. We'll talk about it, just like we split up, how to understand AB 98 of being both policy level and development level. We've got some implementation resources being developed on the policy side, but also some development checklists, some other resources for individual logistics use projects. And then we want to dive a little deeper into a local case study, which is Riverside County. John already hinted at some of this about how they, are approaching implementation and some of their considerations. So we'll dive deeper into that. So I will pass it to Jolene to talk about regional implementation and some of your local work too.
Thank you. As this was all starting to come about, there were several of us that were at Cal APA when the news came down that AB 98 had been signed by the governor. So immediately there was a collaboration and a meeting of the minds of what does this mean for local agencies? How can we get around to what John said, or John was talking about with that regional coordination, especially on the truck routing. That's been something for the last couple of decades I know I've been involved with, from one city to another, and trying to figure out how to I mean, you can think of Eastville and Ontario are a really good example where they have residential on one arterial that as soon as you get into Ontario, it's industrial. So how do you make that work when you're looking at a major region countywide? It's one thing for a local jurisdiction to stand alone and designate its own, but they need to connect and they need to go somewhere and they need to serve the overall region for moving goods. So a lot of what SBCTA and WRCOG started thinking through is, first of all, what do the cities need immediately to help them implement and comply with the AB 98 requirements? So the two of them, we're working with both of them right now to come up with two sets of checklists. One is, what are all the general plan policy issues that the cities need to incorporate and make sure they're in conformance with? And what does the development community and those planners that are working at the desk, the development review desk, what do they need as far as a checklist for understanding what these proposals need to do to make sure they're complying with AB 98 standards? So those two different things are taking place right now. Next week, we have a meeting with SPCTA, the planning directors and public work directors. I believe Chris Gray presented something to his group of cities earlier this week, or it might be tomorrow, but WRCOG is also involved. So this first step is really working with all the agencies to give them a general sense of what's required. And then there will be next steps that have to be taken to make sure that their circulation elements are updated and that their land use plans and housing elements aren't out of compliance with what the city's actual goals are for making sure that they preserve that industrial land. And I'll turn it over to, I don't think I'm on the next slide. Right.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about just industry perspective. And when I say industry, I'm going to use that term as a generic term to represent, private applicants pursuing development applications for logistics use. Industry's definitely waiting for cleanup language. Some of the confusion and ambiguity in the law is causing some of industry to take a pause, wait to see what happens. So there's more clarity on how the cleanup language will impact their decisions to move forward and pursue projects or not. I'm going to speak also just from my opinion and my experience representing applicants and what we've been hearing over the last couple of months on site selection. And just to give a little bit of background, applicants invest millions of dollars in the entitlement process. At the end of an entitlement process, when they get to a planning commission hearing or city council hearing or board of supervisors hearing, they could be $1 million in or more on architecture, engineering, consulting, environmental compliance, eco compliance, et cetera. So this bill is, they need to include it in their risk assessment in their financial decisions as to whether or not to pursue projects or not. Currently, some of the questions that are being asked internal are, one, is the site in the warehouse concentration area? So is the project in the Inland Empire? It's going to be more expensive based on the 21st century and the tier 1 21st century requirements, as well as the general plan update timeline requirements to develop in the Inland Empire. Industry is still very focused on the Inland Empire, has really improved the economy, the job generation. I mean, has been a lot of benefits brought to the region through this industry. They're taking a pause and making some determinations as to whether this is an area to continue to invest in, especially during this, time of uncertainty before cleanup language gets put forth. Also looking at sites very, very carefully. Are there any loading docks that would be positioned in a project design near a sensitive receptor? They're looking at the definitions of the sensitive receptors very carefully. And then is the site on an arterial collector, major thoroughfare, or a local road primarily serving commercial uses. So site selection is becoming extremely important. Next slide. Other considerations, even though right now the bill says, you know, the distance separation from the property line of a sensitive receptor is the loading dock. The interpretation of that is 900 feet is, you know, the golden rule for what needs to be considered. So they're really looking also at their property line. Is their property line within 900 feet of the property line of any sensitive receptor? Also, are there any residential units on the site triggering this 2-to-1 replacement? Industry is not in the business of building housing. So they don't know what options are going to be available to them to replace housing, if there's going to be in lieu fee programs like John mentioned or not. It's probably very unlikely that they're going to be able to replace housing themselves. Again, just they're not residential developers. There's also a lot of questions about types of housing. Does a mobile home count? Does a mobile home count if it's not on a foundation? What if it's an RV parked on a property on wheels? Do we have to look back 10 years to see what was there and whether it was occupied or not? Is the housing substandard? Is anyone living in it? There's a lot of questions around housing. So a lot of the property owners, the residential property owners that have sold their land for development for this type of use have benefited significantly financially. So I know some of the background on the bill were tenants living in homes that were displaced by logistics development projects, but that's not always the case. So whether a site has housing on it or not is a key consideration right now for industry. Also, does the local agency's general plan comply with AB 98? Industry does not really want to get into situations where their projects are being criticized or scrutinized because of a public agency's failure to comply with the requirements to update their own general plan. So that's a consideration that is being discussed. Are the sites large enough to accommodate AB 98's buffering and dock orientation requirements? To get the 50 feet of buffering, the 100 feet of buffering, that requires additional property. And then what is going to go in that area? Is it landscaping? Who's going to own that area? How's it going to be maintained? So sites need to be larger than they were before to accommodate the same building sizes. And then bottom line, can the financing of the project absorb AB 98's 21st century design standards? Some of the design standards are not that expensive to implement. Some of them are very expensive to implement. So the risk assessment on the financial side for the projects and which communities will be invested in and which sites will be selected to pursue logistics entitlement projects on just became a lot more complicated. I will leave it at that. In-house at our firm, we have taken the AB 98 requirements and completed an internal compliance checklist. We're happy to clean this up and distribute it or make it available to anybody where it might be helpful. This will be, if there is cleanup language, this would be revised, but we've taken AB 98 and all the requirements of it and have categorized it. Is the site in the warehouse concentration area or not? Is the proposed building more than 250,000 square feet or not? Does the project entail a change of zone or not? And there's different requirements based on all of those stipulations. So we have a checklist developed. So depending where your project falls, you can use the checklist and go through and make sure that the project complies with all the various items. I imagine that the WRCOG materials and other guidance materials that are being prepared will have a similar checklist.
All right, well, thank you, Jolene and Tracy. Let's, John, let's hear more from you about how you're tackling these different components of the bill.
I think tackling is the correct word. We're just diving right into it at this point in time. I'm going to comment on Tracy. Thank you for putting that checklist together. That's a fantastic idea. When it's completed, can we put it up on the IES-APA website to share that as a document for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect, thank
Yeah.
you.
I was also gonna say, Sean, we can always distribute that as well to the attendees.
All right. Well, let's talk about implementation approach, which literally just happened yesterday at the Board of Supervisors, and we had some lengthy discussions on our internal side about what to do with AB 98, how to implement it, and when to implement it. In case you haven't heard, our county has a lot of industrial development going on right now, and we're getting a lot of pushback from it as well. So we wanted to get ahead of this and help address some of the concerns the community has with siting, with oversaturation, truck routes, all these things. And so it was the collective decision of the board to do two things yesterday. One is immediately amend our good neighbor policy, which we've already had effective for many years, and literally slap on is also the correct term, all of the rules under AB 98 at the end of our good neighbor policy, which now supersedes our old good neighbor policy. And now these rules are effective today. So any new industrial development is going to have to comply with all these rules to the extent that we can and understand and implement them at this point in time. So that was the board's way of addressing the state mandate, the board's way of trying to address the community's concerns and issues by getting ahead of the implementation date, which is still another year from now, but approach it and implement it today. The other thing the board did yesterday was what we call as an initiation. So staff asked the board to initiate an amendment to our land use ordinance, a second amendment to the good neighbor policy, an amendment to our circulation element in our general plan to do all the things we just talked about. We're going to go back, deep dive, and unwind and unravel all of these rules and regulations under AB 98, sort them out and categorize them in a much different, more easily implementable way, and put them back into our good neighbor policy and our ordinance so that they're easier to read, understand, and implement physically. That'll happen quicker than the truck routes. The truck route's going to take the better part of a year to figure out how we can coordinate and do that, and then ultimately update our circulation element to get to that point where we have a truck designation of truck routes countywide. I'm also hoping that as part of the cleanup bill that they will extend that date, understanding the challenges of coordinating truck routes on a whole countywide area is going to be very difficult, and it's going to take longer than a year to do that. If we can show meaningful progress, that we're meeting, that we're coordinating, we're trying to work on this, I'm hoping that'll be sufficient for the state to extend that time frame in an effort to accommodate what's really behind the scenes is going to have to happen. And it's going to be a very expensive process to do all this for all of us too. So as far as logistics project review, we're going to continue processing them as they come in. We're going to be implementing the new rules as best as we can. We're going to be applying the same set of mitigation and doing, this is just one more set of standards, if you will, that we'll just add to the process that we already go through. And hopefully at the end of the day, we have a better product, really, is what it comes down to being as well. And we'll see how it plays out and where we get stuck on some of these provisions and how we can sort of navigate through them and make sure that they're fair to everybody, really, is what it comes down to. That's it.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful to kind of tie it all together and talk, concretely about what we're talking about when we're talking about some of these projects and policies. Okay, so in addition to implementation, and I would say in tangent, there are efforts to clean up the bill. A lot of them have been mentioned already. And I have a list on the next slide of some of those topics, but an important thing to note is that at the end of AB 98 being signed, no one was really happy. The environmental advocates didn't think it was aggressive or went far enough. And then you have all these cleanup issues, and you've got people on the other side, industry side, that said it's went too far. All right. And so by opening it up for cleanup, it is going to be a challenge. We're not saying that all these issues are going to be cleaned up. But there is some recognition at the legislature that this needs to happen, that it was a kind of a crazy process, and that in order to make this bill work, we will need to see significant cleanup. So that being said, here are some of the kind of the top items that are being addressed. There are numerous groups that are working on this, everything from League of City and counties, but also NAOP, as Tracy mentioned, there's a supply chain council. I think there's on the call members of the California chapter of the APA who are also working on cleanup. And so we're all, and then you've got the individual jurisdictions that also have their that there are priorities. And so we're at this point is really, it's kind of getting everything on the board, seeing what we think is feasible and what is going to really help the bill while being politically feasible. So I'm going to open it up for discussion among the panelists. But yeah, I just want, I think I want just to start with Jolene. What is like the piece of cleanup that you are most interested in seeing accomplished? And we can talk about, we can summarize all these for the ones that we don't get to.
I think first and foremost is effective in the approval dates. There is some ambiguity around the definitions of those with what really is the commencement of a local entitlement process and who dictates what that is. I think it puts a lot of pressure on local agencies to try to determine that. And then it causes some, if there isn't a uniform definition as to what that means, then it makes it very difficult for the development community as they jump from jurisdiction to jurisdiction on various projects. But one of the ones that I heard first and foremost, and this is just from working with a couple of the cities that have some older industrial areas where residential has traditionally over the years grown up around it. And as those areas are becoming antiquated and there's a desire to redevelop it, this could make that onerous. It could make it almost impossible if the buildings are too large to bring an antiquated warehouse into the 21st century. So that redevelopment, and also similar to that, the brownfield considerations. So if you have a site within your community that is not really where you would like to put a sensitive receptor, and it is prime for industrial uses, but depending on what's adjacent to it, that also poses some challenges for local jurisdictions to figure out what to do with that land if they can't use it for industrial warehousing. Those are the key ones that I've been hearing, as well as the truck route designations. There's some ambiguity as to the language that talks about, specifically it says for truck routes that are on local streets, I'm just going to read this real quickly, but predominantly serves commercial uses, meaning more than 50% of the properties fronting the road within 1,000 feet are designed for commercial or industrial use. Within 1,000 feet, that's 1/4 mile. So how far away do sensitive receptors need to be from that local corridor for it to be able to be designated as a truck route? That's the other big one. I don't want to take over too much of the time on these. I know Tracy has a number of these, and so does John, that are key issues that have come up for them.
Yeah, excuse me, I can chime in next. I agree, the definition of commencement of local entitlement prior to the September 30th effective date is being interpreted differently amongst different government agencies, and that is causing confusion, meaning if an applicant had a specific plan application submitted, but not an application for an actual building footprint, does the specific plan application constitute commencement of local entitlement? John, I think I heard you say the county just decided no, right? That your county's interpreted as of yesterday that it's a plot plan or a CUP. Did I hear you say that right?
We did. We had lengthy discussions internally on not to get into the weeds on what our foundation general plan amendment process, but it's not a project under CEQA. It's just an initiation, the right to move forward with a project. So we went back and forth on, this is our process and you have to do that. We're moving to the next step. That's one of the arguments. But for the purpose of implementation of this bill, it was decided that the plot plan of the CUP is the project and not that initial foundation GPA.
Yeah. And we're hearing some agencies interpret it that way. Other agencies are interpreting it different. Some of the law firms that we're working with that are representing both agencies and applicants are turning to definitions in the CEQA guidelines, in the California Code of Regulations, like what does commencement of an entitlement process mean. So we're very hopeful that the cleanup legislation is going to clarify that so that there is consistency. Otherwise, it's gonna land on the interpretation of each agency individually and cause a lot of confusion on the applicant side as to whether their project actually commenced and they're subject to the law or not. Also, I think the residential units and the replacement housing needs some clarification, particularly like non-conforming residential structures. So we have residential structures that are in industrial zones and aren't intended to be there long-term. So do those count as a sensitive receptor? Some residential structures aren't actually being used for residential use. I think John mentioned, you know, in the county, we have some residential structures and they're being used for now, maybe they were occupied as residential over the last 10 years, but they're now being used for a business, or maybe there's even truck storage happening behind the home, et cetera. So I think the bill definitely needs some clarification on both the definition of sensitive receptor, whether non-conforming sensitive receptor residential counts, and what counts on the property for a replacement house. I think the enforcement provisions definitely also need some clarification, as well as the definition of the expansion of a use. Is it only the size of the use on the ground? We had a question come to our office. Well, what if we raise the roof of the building and expand the amount of building in the space, but don't physically expand the footprint? Does that count as an expansion of the building? We don't know. So I just think though, you know, it's new, and as questions come up, we're going to have to seek answers from them, and enough questions have been asked repetitively about the same items that there's probably is some consensus at this point about what needs to be cleaned.
Really helpful. John.
Sure, tag me in. All right. One of the items that's not on here that I had a little trouble with is the definition of a sensitive receptor. So it's a pretty robust, expanded definition through this bill, quite a bit different than the CEQA's definition of a sensitive receptor, and even different than some of our own internal definitions of a sensitive receptor in our own zoning ordinance. So which supersedes it, right? Do we only apply this version of it to warehouse? Do we now expand sensitive receptors with this definition to everything? I mean, how far do we take it, right? And so we have our own version of that definition when it comes to cannabis separations from residential to cannabis facilities. And then of course there's a CEQA version of it, and now there's this. So it's a very broad term and definition of sensitive receptor, which it may not ever change. I don't know if that's been one of the things that they're looking at, sort of narrowing down a little bit more, but it's a lot, and Tracy mentioned this already, it's a lot to take into account for when you're looking at those setback requirements. So that's one of the big ticket items. Tracy talked all about the nuances to the replacement housing and marginal housing. Is it a house? It is not a house. So that really needs to be clarified as well. One of the other things that I'm struggling with now is knowing that all of these changes are going to be coming before us. It's a very expensive, time-consuming, resource-consuming thing to update an ordinance, right? There's all these steps you have to go through on the county and city sides to amend an ordinance. So do we just sit on these rules now and not take the effort to amend our ordinances or apply these things until these changes are done? And is this going to be a year's effort or just 6 months, or when are these changes going to happen? So we have to kind of play out, you know, whether or not we want to commit resources to fully implementing and fully baking these changes into our ordinance, or sit on this and wait until these are clarified a little bit more and given back to us in a more linear format. So those are some of the things I'm struggling with on the public sector side.
Yeah, I think, I mean, a clear message needs to be sent to the legislature that the speed to which the cleanup is going to occur needs to be quick. Because as John mentioned, a lot of resources need to be put into implementation. And if there's going to be a cleanup bill, knowing about it sooner rather than later is going to be very important, because resource spend may be wasted if efforts are put into complying with a bill that may have language changes that may be of a significant nature.
Good point. I think it's important to mention, if it takes the standard process, it wouldn't go into effect until the same day the circulation plan updates would be required in the update. So they'd have to do some kind of they'd have to make it an emergency statute. It's just it's a lot to track, and yeah, like you said, it kind of a gamble. One other thing I know is a priority is the top one. This just make recognizing how hard it is to get a general plan amendment approved, and how long it takes, creating some kind of safe harbor for jurisdictions, especially in the warehouse concentration district, that creates a safe harbor for these jurisdictions that are trying to do the right thing, trying to meet the requirements, but just by the nature of the project are not going to meet the deadline. So I know that's a requirement. I mean a priority. And then I think the message too from the region, probably from the state, is the way that this bill came to be is just very problematic. And you know, it was so closed door. And so I know that's a message that a lot of groups are sending, is we can't legislate this way in the future. So any of these other cleanup items that we want to highlight before jumping to the next slide?
I'd like to just add one thing on what local jurisdictions are doing as far as their general plan updates. I mean, typically it takes at least a year for that budget session to even take place, where a city can allocate funds and appropriate funds for updating their circulation element. But one of the other issues is that AB 98 has some pretty restrictive and explicit requirements for outreach that sound as I'm reading it, they seem to be a little bit more intense than what a typical general plan update might be for cleaning something up like this. So especially when it comes to truck routes and designating those truck routes, the type of engagement that might be necessary at the local level to make sure that everybody is involved and engaged and has a voice in designating those truck routes, a year is not sufficient. That's hard enough for just a simple general plan update. But to get to that point where you're not only doing it within your city, but to John's point, you're coordinating with the adjacent jurisdictions and with the county as a whole, that need for expanding that effective date is, I think it's one of the most pressing things for local agencies.
Taylor, if I may, I just wanted to share a comment from Lauren de Valencia from Cal APA. She's stating that they're trying very hard to convey the issues with timelines and cost for our membership. So just want to share that.
Yep. And Lauren, thanks for commenting she is the lobbyist for the chapter. So she was on the front lines on this one and lost a lot of sleep in the late legislative session. So I'm glad you could join, Lauren. All right. So if there's nothing else anyone wants to mention on cleanup, we can move to audience question and answers. I see a couple in the Q&A, but we really want to hear from you on if you're at a jurisdiction, what you're working on, what questions you have, and then same thing if you're on the private side, what questions do you have? I'll ask the first one, Robert, and then you can field others.
Yep.
But this was I'll do the first one. It's asking about tracking of industrial projects throughout the region, and Tracy was wondering if there is any kind of tracking going on for industrial projects, both before that September 30th date and then new ones after. Are you aware of any group that is tracking that across jurisdictions?
Oh, I'm sorry, were you asking me?
No, I'm asking anyone in the panel.
Oh, okay. I know that there's some nonprofit groups that are doing that, and there is a online map that is available on their website. I don't have it handy. I have to pull it, but I know there's one or two nonprofit groups that are trying to track it across jurisdictions. Obviously, the jurisdictions are tracking it themselves. But I'm not aware of any public agency that is doing a comprehensive tracking across the entire region, if that was what the question was.
Yeah,
John, do
no,
you know of any?
I do not.
On the county level, we're obviously tracking our own industrial development. We have mapped out our own GIS app and spreadsheets and stuff, and for the purposes of environmental justice reporting back to the state. So we're tracking it on a couple different ways, but we're not tracking the city's development, just the county unincorporated areas.
Great.
good question.
Great question. And just some logistics. If you have a question, feel free to submit it in the Q&A. Yesenia will be reading those out here shortly. But I also want to offer the opportunity for anyone to offer to ask their question themselves. So if that is the case, you can raise your hand and we'll allow you to talk or speak, and then you can ask your questions. While we wait for that, somebody take advantage of that. We'll go ahead and read the second question. I'll do that for now. And it's coming from an unknown attendee, but it says, has it come up what the responsibility is to review for sensitive receptors that are outside of the jurisdictional boundary? For example, would reviewers be required to review for sensitive receptors in Nevada or Arizona where 8B98 has no effect? And I'll open that up to any other panelists.
Well, I know it's come up. It's not an unknown thing. So I chair the Intermodal Freight Committee for Transportation Research Board, which is National Academies. And as part of this, I have been receiving emails from some members of my committee and just other people that are interested, knowing that I work in California, to understand what this could potentially mean for other states. They know that it's in their mind, it probably won't happen in a lot of states, but they are thinking ahead that a lot of what happens in California ends up in one form or another being proposed in another state. So I haven't seen any legislation out there, at least from my perspective, but I know that there are agencies and researchers and planners across the country that are carefully watching this.
Great, thank you. I think this next question was written for Tracy. For the 21st Century Warehouse, would a project that has 8 industrial warehouses under 250,000 square feet be subject to the rule?
Yeah,
or
that,
combined over 250 square feet. And I say this because I know you raised this issue before.
yeah,
so-
that was actually, I didn't mention it, but it was in the cleanup list. So that is not clear in the legislation now. And we're hoping that that is in one of the cleanup items.
All right. And
I'll just say,
Oh, go
the
ahead.
four of us on the panel, or 5 of us on the panel, we don't have the answers to everything. So if we don't have an accurate answer and someone else in the audience, you know the answer, just put the answer in the chat and we'll make sure we're watching the chat and everybody has benefit of an answer if we don't, someone else has it and we don't.
Just to chime in on that, Josh Lee from SBCTA has answered a couple of the questions that have come up, meaning SBCTA, for example, is tracking development.
In San Bernardino County.
Yes, so, and it's through their development mitigation annual reporting process. And I think there was that was the response on that one.
Right.
And I know WRCOG does have some similar type list tracking projects. Not sure it's really tied to AB 98, but it'd be good to reach out to them to find out if they are. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Since I don't see any hands up, feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak and I can unmute you. But the next question is, does AB 98 require any amendments to the EJ element in general plans? And I believe was that Jolene that went over the general plan requirements?
Yeah, and I mean, it strengthens them. I can't think of any element of the EJ elements that, if anything, it would just be a reference to AB 98. The majority of it is in line with, I haven't seen anything that's conflicting with what's in the EJ elements.
I would maybe caveat that with, you probably don't want to check your EJ element or your policies, however you structured it. Make sure there are no conflicts, that one doesn't supersede or conflict with each other. For this round and also for the next round with the cleanup, just to be sure. A good question.
I mean, obviously you have the consistency matter when you're updating your general plan, so this may be something that will in essence impact environmental justice from my perspective, but there, you know, whether there's a specific requirement that requires you to update that or some of the policies associated to EJ, I don't believe so. And then we have a comment from Eric Koch from California APA. And it says, if anybody on the webinar has specific concerns or feedback to inform cleanup legislation, please email the policy at apacalifornia.org. And the APA California chapter policy and legislative team will communicating with legislators in the coming weeks. I want to share that. We'll wait if we have to see if we have any hands raised, which we don't right now. We just got one more question or comment. It says the definition of for warehouse concentration region includes San Bernardino County, San Bernardino and Riverside counties, as well as a handful of cities. Does the warehouse concentration region only include unincorporated areas within the counties or all cities within the county?
That's up for interpretation.
Expand, please, Jolene. We've talked about this one too.
Yeah, I think the majority of us, when you read it, and you know, there are several more cities, those cities are all within the counties of San Bernardino and Riverside, and there are a number of cities that are not named. So intuitively, you would think it's only the unincorporated areas of those counties. But unfortunately, the way the legislation is written, it says the counties of San Bernardino and Riverside and the cities of. So it doesn't say the unincorporated portions of those counties. So I know there are some cities that are in those counties that aren't named, but are trying to be proactive and thinking ahead in the event that that interpretation were to come back, that includes them too.
Thank you. I still don't see any hands up, no brave souls out there. So if you are willing to ask your question live, please raise your hand and we will allow you to speak. I can move on to the next question. We do have one more. Was there anything in AB 98 for expanded radiuses for noticing requirements, including any bilingual noticing?
No.
Didn't see anything on noticing. Yeah.
I know there was some legislation that also passed this year that expanded noticing requirements for other situations, but I don't believe it applies to AB 98 specifically. We have no more questions in the Q&A. I don't see any other comments or possible questions in the comment section. So if you last call, if you have any questions, please raise your hand or add it to the Q&A and we can go ahead and answer. But if we don't, any closing remarks from our panelists?
Yeah, I can start. And I'm just gonna speak as like an AICP certified planner back from like my planning school days. I mean, when we think back when, you know, this land use was introduced, what was in like everybody's code? Like warehouse meant like a Costco or a Sam's Club. So, you know, from my perspective, just as planners, we weren't really ready, right, for this land use to come at us so hard and so fast. And so was it planned for? No. And it's been really interesting over time for me to watch the pattern of logistics development, especially in areas around the ports in LA and particularly the Inland Empire. It has brought a lot of economic opportunity and uplift to a lot of communities. You know, as the land use pattern has developed and buildings have been placed somewhat thoughtfully and other times haphazardly. It seems like when you look at a map, right, as a planner, you look down, like where are all the rectangular buildings located? There are efficiencies with them being located near each other. It reduces trips. The trucks aren't always going back and forth to the ports. They're servicing each other. So trucks are going from warehouse to warehouse. It makes sense for them to be in concentrated locations. When you look at the distribution or the distance from the ports and how goods move from, you know, the world to the ports to the sorting facilities to your doorstep, it's so fascinating, like the transportation geography, just from a planner's perspective. So, you know, communities that are welcoming to this use, I think, have experienced a lot of advantages. And with that comes criticism on land use and why weren't we prepared for this land use and why didn't we have a plan for trucks and routing and where these buildings were going to go. So I think with AB 98 on the table, it does provide an opportunity for a variety of different perspectives to put all their thoughts in the same bucket to get something on paper that makes sense. From my perspective, unfortunately, I agree the way the bill was done. It was really unfortunate that it was just kind of came out quick. It was kind of, you know, forced on everybody. We're all left with trying to interpret it, help public agencies through the implementation process, help applicants through the application process. It's kind of like a spaghetti mess right now, but I'm hopeful, you know, as a planner at the end of the day, that the land use pattern established, you know, through this use is going to be eventually welcomed, you know, widely welcomed, especially as the trucks transition to electricity and the grid is developed and the grid strength is, you know, stronger to power the vehicle types that California is pushing. So I think it's been a lot to take in. It's been interesting over the last 10 or 15 years to watch where this was going. I'm very hopeful that there's a solution at hand through this and other things to have us all as planners be proud of where the buildings are placed and how they're working in the communities and the economic opportunities they've brung and the job opportunities they've brung, et cetera. And I'll just say, you know, personally, I'm a mentor through the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. My little sister, who I've been with for 10 years now, she's working at a distribution facility. It has been an incredible opportunity for her life. And I know there's a lot of things that are said negatively about the land use, but there's also a lot of positive things that can be said about the land use. And as planners, I just feel like it's incumbent upon us to make the best decisions we can to move this forward and into a good place. So I'm just going to leave it there. Those are my final thoughts.
This is great.
Thank you.
Let's hear from Jolene next.
Okay, I know when we first started talking about this, I know Taylor, with you specifically, it's similar to Tracy, AICP background, started out working for local cities, city of Pasadena, city of Irvine, and ended up at the Port of Long Beach. And that's when I really understood what we have in California as far as one of the strongest logistics centers in not only the nation, but in the country, in the world. So what we've built around the ports of LA, Long Beach, it's more than just what's coming through those ports. It's all of the activity because of the consumer base that we have in Southern California. We have 39 million people. And most of that does move by truck. And we don't serve just Southern California. We serve Las Vegas and Phoenix by truck also. So it's a very complicated, very closely knit supply chain. And it's a huge economic engine for our region. How quickly it came on, I think some of us, like me working for the port, I saw it coming before others in the industry. Started working with some of our local communities, like the city of Wilmington area, which is actually a piece of Los Angeles County, but trying to work with some of those local communities to figure out how we could better operate adjacent to them, improving their communities at the same time, trying to make sure that we were keeping the port moving. I think what I learned from there is what this bill was really intending to do is try to make logistics facilities better neighbors and make our communities more livable. How it came about wasn't ideal. I think it was a response to some bad actors, some bad planning. You look at the Bloomington case where they wiped out some homes to build a logistics facility that was going to be adjacent to a school, is part of the reason why this came into being in the first place. What we can do better, a lot of the good neighbor policies that have come out, not just from locally within like Riverside County, some of the cities like Beaumont, but also at the federal level. So FHWA has been pushing some of this down through their freight group. And we're not the only region in the country that is dealing with this. You look at Lehigh Valley up in Pennsylvania, very similar issues. I think what Lehigh Valley is doing really well that we could emulate is their multi-jurisdictional planning. And I think it's going to take something like that, especially on the truck routing side. And not just on the truck routing side, but something that I know a lot of our communities are complaining about is truck parking. Trucks are parking on streets for a reason. They have a 1-hour appointment system. They need to arrive in time to not miss that appointment, have to wait another day when they get paid by the load. So where are they going to stage? They usually arrive a couple hours early because of the traffic here in Southern California. So that's the other aspect of this that I think we as a region could address, is not just the overall logistics siting, but also paying attention to the secondary impacts that we need to start planning for. So that's my, I mean, what I'm happy about with this legislation going through is that it is bringing this to the forefront and forcing a lot of local agencies to have a better understanding of what logistics is and what supply chains are. And hopefully in the end, we'll be ahead of the game. Thanks for
Jolene.
inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, this has been so great. Let's hear from John before we close out.
Thank you. A couple of closing thoughts. Planning and the planning process itself really boils down to a series of trade-offs. We're trying to balance competing interests, from jobs creation to the community, to the environment. And how do we do all that? How do we achieve that balance over time? And one of the ways not to do that is when the state mandates these legislative acts, it has the unintended consequences again of potentially pushing industrial development out further and further and further, because you can't meet the requirements in the areas and the clusters where it should be going. There's a reason we have industrial developments along transportation corridors, close to access points, in areas that have infrastructure, right? It's easy for the trucks to get in and out of there and serve the communities, serve the areas it needs to. But when you start pushing truck system logistic warehouses way out into the desert, way out in the middle of nowhere, those trucks have to come back in to serve the community. They have to come back in to serve the other distribution facilities. So they have to go somewhere. And I think going back to the balance again, we can do a better job as public sector employees, private sector and developers by understanding what these issues are that these logistic warehouses are creating for the communities, and then address it, right? Address those issues, right? We can make warehouses, industrial development work in communities if they're designed appropriately, right? If there are those setbacks, if there are those buffering, there's ways to make them better, make them more compatible, make them work together, right? You're gonna have trucks, that's just the nature of where we are, but we have to look at the bigger picture and the long run, right? And we've started really deep diving planning ahead for logistics over the past 5-10 years. And I think we've made a lot of ground. We've come a long way on the design, orientation, and mitigation for these large warehouses. We've got more work to do. We can still do better, but we're getting there. And thank you for putting this on. Great workshop.
No, excellent. Thanks everyone for your participation and really guiding this webinar. You were really involved in the planning and just shaping of it. So just really appreciate all your work and sharing your insight. I think we've just got a couple questions that came in. If we could, and then we can close.
Sure, I'll read the one I was going to read before we close. One question that came in while we were closing out, it says, my city has an existing truck route through our circulation element. Do we still need to do outreach? And they're assuming that the answer is yes.
If you're going to amend it, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
I would just say, if you have one adopted, that fulfills the criteria of having a truck route. But to your point, I think you're gonna say it should be looked at over time, maybe some amendments necessary to it, but I see you've got a leg up on all of us already. Congratulations.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, this is one of the questions that's come up with as we've been revisiting and updating some of the circulation elements within communities. Some of those truck routes don't meet the requirements. So are they grandfathered in? There's nothing in the legislation that I read that allows those to be grandfathered in. So do they need to have an exception? Can they remain as is? Do they need to be changed? Those are my questions.
Great, and we have no other questions online and no hands raised, no brave souls. We'll go ahead and wrap up if you don't mind, Taylor.
Yeah, please.
Great. So just wanted some housekeeping items. There's some contact information on the slide, the last slide there. We will be distributing the slides. This webinar is being recorded, so we'll distribute that to not only the attendees, but also the membership on our website and via e-blast and things of that nature. Also, any of the information that came out of this event, including checklist, a possible available checklist, and other details in the chat box will be shared with that same distribution so that everybody can have that. But feel free to reach out to any of us. And if you have any questions or if you need some feedback. But other than that, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Thank the panelists for joining us. And thank you all for sticking around to the end.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. And one last thing. Please remember to put your name and contact information in the chat box because there is SEAM credits provided for this workshop. And we want to capture and ensure that we can confirm that you were here. So if you want to add it in the chat box, if you haven't already, please do so. Brian, can we end the workshop?